Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Shoesmiths Shared and Halved webinar on COVID-19. My name is Simon McArdle. I'm a partner in the commercial group, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Today's session is part of a series of collaborative webinars aimed at business leaders that will look at implications of the coronavirus crisis and hopefully help you deal with the many challenges that your business is currently facing. COVID-19 is a crisis unlike any other that we faced as a community or a country, presenting a new and varied set of challenges to the UK and global businesses. The COVID-19 outbreak is causing disruption to the ability of businesses to perform their regulatory obligations, resulting in confusion about how to keep employees safe while crucially keeping businesses running. In this session, we will explore common issues businesses are facing and how to avoid some of the pitfalls that we are seeing in the marketplace. Today's session will be a panel discussion tackling the questions that you have posed ahead of the webinar. As ever, we've had a huge amount of questions and we can't answer them all one by one in a single session. So what we've done ahead of time is we have done our best to combine similar questions, and we will work through those as best we can over the course of this session. The questions can be grouped into 5 broad themes. Safety in the workplace, when that workplace is not at home. Working from home. PPE, employment issues, and then coming out of lockdown. So we'll be working through questions in each of those categories. There will be a mix of technical, legal, and also practical guidance throughout the session. If, as we go along, anybody has any questions, you should see on the right-hand side of your screen a Q&A tab that will allow you to pose questions to the panel. You can also send those privately as a message through to me using the same tab. So if you drop those in, we'll pick those up as we go where we can, and failing that, we've left some time at the end of the session to deal with those. If I could introduce you to the panel members then. So firstly, Hayley Saunders. Hayley is a partner in the regulatory team and specializes in defending companies and individuals in respect of all regulatory matters, and in particular, health and safety prosecutions and inquests that are conducted in the criminal courts. Hayley has a lot of experience advising and representing clients in the retail, construction, and healthcare sectors. Paul Eccles. Paul is a partner in the commercial insurance team. His areas of specialism include employers and public liability issues, insurance policy cover, and product liability. His experience over the last 15 years is largely in food, retail, engineering, manufacturing, and the construction sectors. He has a great deal of experience in occupational disease claims in all of these sectors. Something of a sobering thought as we were preparing for this session is that some of the experience Paul will be drawing upon will be his live cases concerning Woolworths, which closed its doors 12 years ago. So let's hope we're not still dealing with COVID-19 claims in 2032, Paul. Finally, Emma Morgan. Emma is a partner in the employment team. Emma specializes in both employment and business immigration law. So with COVID-19 and Brexit still looming, she's a good person to know. Emma has worked with clients in a variety of sectors, and in particular has experience of advising clients in the retail, logistics, and transport sectors. So let's kick off. The first theme, or the first group of questions, is around safety in the workplace when that workplace is away from home. The first question is, how can you enforce social distancing in a small office space when there's no ability to work from home? In certain circumstances where it may not be possible to abide by the 2-meter social distancing rules in a workplace, what additional measures would you expect employers to have in place to mitigate against the risk of any potential enforcement action. Hayley, would you like to field that one?
Yes, I will. Thanks, Simon. Good afternoon, everybody. We obviously know that as a result of the government legislation, certain businesses have been forced to close, those being obviously pubs, restaurants, hairdressers and the like. In relation to any other business, they all remain open and employees can travel to and from work if they obviously can't work from home. So if you can't work from home, the duty on the employers is to follow the Public Health England guidelines on social distancing, hand washing and the other matters that we all know about. So if you're expecting your staff to come into the workplace, that's the guidance as an employer that you're expected to follow. So the hand washing is easy. That's one of the easier things to comply with. Social distancing is obviously more difficult, especially when you've got small workplaces such as offices. Depending on the industry in which you operate, there is industry-specific sector guidance that's been issued by the government in terms of how you can enforce or implement social distancing measures. So industries such as logistics, people working in the health and social care sector, construction, farming, retail, food supply, there is specific guidance for those industries in terms of how you can implement social distancing measures. Nothing for offices, though, certainly not from what I can see. And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know whether the government thought that if you work in an office normally, then it should be relatively easy to work from home, which we've had our technology challenges, but on the whole, we can do it. And perhaps that's why the government hasn't issued specific guidance on those that are now being asked to attend offices and work. So if that is the case, if you are expecting your employees to come into the office because they can't work from home, then what can you as the employer do to mitigate any potential enforcement action? As with any health and safety issue, the starting point, the critical starting point always is a risk assessment, and even more so now than in any other times in terms of making sure that risk assessment is detailed, bespoke, relevant for the organisation and obviously relevant to deal with the issues and the risks that are arising from the virus. You know, now really is not the time to be relying on one of those generic documents. So all material risks need to be considered to the extent that they impact on the business. And in doing so, my advice obviously is to consult with all stakeholders within the organisation. And when I say consult, I don't mean in a formal, let's go away and have a chat for a couple of weeks and come back and issue some new guidelines. You know, time really is of the essence. Consult with the employee. They are the ones that know how to do their job. They are the ones that are in the know in terms of how they think those risks can be controlled and reduced so far as is reasonably practicable. So it's about considering everything. You know, what is the task that you are asking the employee to carry out? Is there an alternative? It's thinking differently in terms of staff that are using canteens and breakout areas to have their lunch. You know, we need to maintain the social distancing measures where we can, and that's crucial. The government says where possible. But things like, you know, asking your employees if it's possible to bring a packed lunch and go and sit in their car and eat it is reasonable, so they're not congregating all in one area. You know, what are the particular risks from vulnerable people, employees with certain conditions or circumstances that you need to consider? And then ultimately, obviously, is it essential that the task is actually carried out? And I think ultimately that's the question that the government wants businesses to ask itself. Do we actually have to carry out this task? And I know there's lots of consequences of not carrying on your business, the economic ones and all of that aside. But it really is thinking outside the box in terms of the control measures that you can put in place. Implementing adequate control measures will mean looking at that that guidance document from Public Health England in terms of social distancing, and that says it must be achieved where possible. Now, where possible is obviously the key bit, and this is where it will come down to your risk assessment and how good that risk assessment is, because employers have the duty. The Health and Safety at Work Act obviously places the duty on employers to do all that's reasonably practicable. And it's a generic duty, but it's an onerous duty, and it's having to do all that's reasonably practical, not just a bit of, or not just what's convenient, or not what is the cheapest in terms of cost. So this is where the really detailed and comprehensive risk assessment, in my view, really comes into play. It must be thorough, it must be relevant, it must deal with all the relevant risks and control measures that need to be implemented to reduce it so far as it's reasonably practicable. If there's any derogation from the guidance, that needs to be justified. And the extent to which the employer is going to be justified by moving away from that 2-metre provision is obviously going to be dependent on the task in hand and the type of business that the employer is operating. Some decisions may incur extra costs, they may incur costs through delay, but I think the government and any regulator will see that as a reasonable consequence. There are lots of things to consider. Ultimately, if you do get to the position as an outcome of your risk assessment where employees do need to work within that 2-metre rule, then we'll have to look at PPE as well, and we'll come on to dealing with some specific PPE issues because there's been a number of questions on that. But my view, in terms of reducing that risk of enforcement action, it's got to be, you must be able to justify your decision. It can't just be through inconvenience that you choose not to follow those guidelines, and certainly not through costs either. It needs to be justifiable. Paul, I don't know if you've got anything to add from a civil perspective in terms of that.
No, I think you've covered pretty much all of it, to be honest, Hayley. The government guidelines, I would say, from a litigator's perspective, are the basics as a bare minimum, But the key for me when I'm looking at these sorts of employers' liability cases, it's not about just sort of looking at this, understanding it, ticking boxes. It's about real living and breathing enforcement and management of it. That's what courts look for. And if you don't have that, I realise, that one of the basics or one of the points in the question was that there was no ability to work from home and sort of being confined in small offices or perhaps spaces. But I think you're right, Hayley. If it's a dangerous situation, we really need to look at it, whether it's essential. For me, consulting with the employees, communication with the employees about their particular positions is key. So I don't think you can just put it in the too difficult box. I actually saw, funnily enough, this morning in the Talking Retail magazine, somebody had sent me a link about the GMB union sending a letter to all the big supermarkets and the Drinks Federation, about not meeting these challenges. So there's going to be a lot of pressure, I think, coming from those sorts of circles as well. But other than that, hey, I agree with essentially everything you've said.
The next key question, I think you may have touched on some of this already, is who decides what is safe, and is there a particular method to achieve COVID-19 compliance status? Is it perhaps the case that there isn't a one-size-fits-all, Hayley?
I would love to have an answer to this question, and I think everybody would love to have a black and white answer as to what is safe, and I think answering that question is certainly difficult in these times. It's difficult in any time. It's a bit similar to the question where we'll get clients ask, what is reasonably practicable? What does that mean? And I think if we could package that up and sell it, then, well, I probably certainly wouldn't be sitting here today with a job. But it is really, really difficult, and not wanting to sound like a typical lawyer or say it's a grey area, but it really isn't that easy. And what is safe and what is reasonably practicable will vary dependent on the organisation. It really is unique to that particular company. It's the tasks that they carry out, it's the people that they employ, the risks that are involved, the members of the public that they may meet. In terms of who ultimately decides what's safe, it's a jury. If it's a criminal health and safety trial, I'm sure for Paul it will be a judge in the county court if it's a civil matter. And any jury will reach their decision, obviously based on all of the evidence that's put forward in the defence case, and that defence that needs to be put forward by the employer is that they have done all that's reasonably practicable. So the strength of that defence is obviously going to lie in the evidence, and as we've touched on, the evidence is going to be risk assessments, and it's not just the written documentation, it's the implementation, it's the monitoring, it's the regular review, it's the communication with staff, it's all of those things that need to be put forward. There's no expectation that all risk needs to be eliminated. That would be brilliant if it could, and that would be in an ideal world if we could live in it, but we don't. So it's reducing the risk so far as is reasonably practicable. And as I say, that's a difficult question to answer generically. It really is dependent on each particular organisation.
Emma, from an employment perspective, what's your take on this?
Well, I think as Hayley's really, really well laid out, there is no complete standard that we can work to in this, and it is about what's reasonable. But I think the main thing at the moment that I think there has to be comfort in knowing that everyone's in the same boat at the moment. There are no stupid questions here, because a lot of this, whether we're talking about furlough, whether we're talking about what's a safe environment, all of these things that are changing and developing every day. We've never been in a situation like this before. So I think we're learning all the time from experience, and also looking at what other employers are doing and what's working. And I think a lot of these come down to engagement and communication and understanding, even as far as government policy goes in terms of lockdown. I mean, every day we're reminded of why we're in lockdown. And the same then applies in terms of your workplaces and actually getting engagement from your workforce and understanding why you've got these in place, because that then means they've got them engaged, they're understanding, and hopefully that can then filter through in everything they do and how they do their work. But I think, to be able to say, yeah, you're 100% guaranteed, that's not going to happen, unfortunately. But what we can do is try and lessen that risk, mitigate it, and learn and engage. I think engagement and communication with staff is so key on this.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I was going to say Boris Johnson, but that wouldn't be a helpful answer, would it?
Well, speaking of Boris Johnson, the next question is about contracting COVID at work. I don't know what rights he's exploring currently with his employers, but Hayley, I think this may be one for you. So, how can employers reduce the likelihood of a successful HSE prosecution arising from a staff member contracting COVID at work? And in particular, I know we've had a number of queries around Section 2 offences.
Yeah, and Simon, essentially it goes back to the previous answer, which I won't repeat because I was conscious I waffled on for some time, but it really goes back to emphasising the fundamental importance of the risk assessment. And again, it's not just the fact that the risk assessment is in writing, it's consulting with all staff, implementing it, monitoring, review, all of the other stuff that all of the other safety professionals that will be listening to this webinar will know about. The HSE have publicly stated that in terms of their criminal enforcement position, that they're going to adopt a reasonable and proportionate approach, which is an approach you'd always like to think they adopt. But certainly in these times, they recognise the challenges that employers face at the moment during these difficult times, and they're appreciative of that fact. So they are, they're certainly not condoning a relaxation of the rules or the regulations, but in terms of enforcement, they will have some sympathy with the position. That obviously being said, employers can't be complacent. This doesn't come back to a position where you can choose not to comply with the guidance because it's merely inconvenient or it costs a bit too much money. You have to, again, be seen and do all that's reasonably practicable. And again, just going back to the employee communication point before when I mentioned in terms of putting the risk assessments together, I do think that's vitally important to obviously consult with them, but keep them informed constantly about what's happening in terms of the changes that's happening in their workplace, because what we can probably all see from the media at the moment is where we have employees that are disgruntled, perhaps for a number of reasons, and perhaps quite rightly so, but sometimes it can come down to lack of communication from their employer about what is happening in the workplace to keep them safe. And if they don't feel that their rights are being looked after, then the first organisation they go and snitch to is probably the regulator. And we've seen local authorities and the HSE go in and visit premises, warehouses, for example, who are doing the pick and pack orders for clothes and various other non-essential items to be delivered, going in there and carrying out inspections. So that can obviously carry more of a reputational damage, even if a prosecution doesn't necessarily flow from that. And just one other point, sorry, we mentioned corporate liability for Section 2, which is obviously the general duty of employers to employees, but just thinking as well in terms of personal liability for directors and senior managers. If offences are committed with their consent, connivance, or attributable to their neglect, then they may be culpable. And I think it's going to take a specific set of circumstances to achieve personal liability and corporate liability to a certain extent. And each case is obviously going to turn on its facts. I don't think the HSE will be quick to prosecute, or local authorities will be. They're certainly going to look at the facts and circumstances. But I think reducing the risk of employees going to the regulator is one of the key issues for employers, because the whistleblowing issue is quite important, I think.
Okay. Which leads us on to the next question, which was, so let's assume that a sufficient risk assessment is in place, and an employee submits a claim for allegedly contracting coronavirus at work. We've had a question that would their success not be unlikely due to the, quote, exceptional circumstances, and how hard to prove for the employer. Paul, I think that's perhaps one for you.
Yeah, sure. So you're breaking up slightly, Simon. I don't know if that's because of the position of your headset or not. Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think it's really because they're exceptional circumstances that perhaps theoretically it's more likely to attract liability. I mean, we're already on notice of, what the specific risks are from extensive government guidance. I appreciate that's a movable feast. We've got the regulations in place, so there's a clear sort of identification of risk that places us all under a duty. I think the second part of that question is perhaps the more difficult one in terms of proving, if you like, an employer's actions caused COVID. It's not straightforward. I'd say very, very good question, but I think for me, there are probably 2 or 3 areas that I would sort of, or perhaps ingredients I would use to answer that part of the question. I think first it's going to possibly be possible with us all on lockdown now to, if you like, factually narrow down the probability of who has exposed somebody. So whether that's a family member or in a workplace. So for instance, if the only outside contact one of your employees has had is with a family member who has no symptoms, it's easier to narrow down. Whereas if they've had other contacts, shopping, workplace, family members, if they're not observing lockdown or if they're vulnerable, then I accept that's not an easy scenario but I think it's possible to prove it, certainly, and sort of failure to take reasonable steps that we've been talking about, or Hayley has been talking about. That's an ingredient that we need to be proved as well. I think the other thing that occurred to me, and I've seen no sensible, real sort of guidance on it, so I'm really drawing on current case law legislation and my own experience. And that really is, it depends how the courts treat this. Will they treat it like a back injury case or a broken leg, or will they treat it like they do other occupational disease cases, such as sort of asbestos, RSI, that sort of thing, in which case you can have, or you could, I can conceive you could have cases where you might have a number of potential causes of illness, multiple causation issues, and if they treat it like other disease cases, a claimant or an employee would only have to demonstrate realistically that the exposure sort of contributed, or I think the case law suggests a material contribution to contracting the disease. So that's an interesting angle that I don't think I think we need to be alive to. I think the last sort of ingredient, if you like, that I would look at is, and it's what I said in response to the answer Haley gave to the first question, and that really is living and breathing your health and safety and risk assessments. You know, the reason a lot of cases fail in front of judges is because I can't show a paper trail to prove that you've taken all the steps you said you're going to in your policies and procedures. So, it might be easier to have to have claims, or for claimants to prove cases where you're dealing with, say, essential or key workers in this current sort of climate and environment. But I wouldn't just assume that. I think it will be a fertile ground for claimant lawyers to have a look at. In fact, I was reading yesterday, I can't remember where, in one of the newspapers, that in Australia already they're bringing worker compensation claims, as they call them. A number of claims are already being brought there. And as many of you will probably know, they've got a very similar legal system to us. So, great question, not an easy answer, Simon.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to move on in that case from the non-home working to home working, if we can. So the next question being that fortunately some employees are able to work from home. We've been asked, what health and safety duties do we owe to our employees when they are working from home? For instance, their home desk, chair setup, which employers have no visibility or control over. What should employers be doing now to avoid potential claims for instance, RSI or back injuries? Are there any practical steps that can be taken to mitigate that exposure? Haley, start with you.
I was just going to say, Paul, I think you were going to pick up this answer.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely.
So I can chip in with my bit.
No, that's absolutely fine. I've got some of the questions in a slightly different order, but absolutely no matter whatsoever. So I think practicality here is everything for me. So the usual things you do in your work environment, for instance, training, regular communication and monitoring of employees, I think is absolutely it's a much more onerous management ask, I think, of businesses at the moment. And I in terms of, I think, what was Simon part of the question about having no visibility? I think, not sure I would necessarily agree with that, with the technology we've got, and phones and so on and so forth. I certainly think it's probably, a lot of us are not used to at home working, that's for sure. But certainly I know, I had a look at, when I was sort of looking at this question earlier, there's some fantastic guidance on the HSE website, for instance, depending on what sort of, is always a great starting point as a minimum. But really having those paper trails, as I said earlier, and proving that you've being able to sort of prove that you've done this stuff and you're taking it seriously is the key. And it's sort of, keeping in touch with them. It's looking at what sort of activities they'll be doing. Can it be done safely? What control measures? That sort of the basic guidance that we all usually look at is a great starting point, I think. I mean, I think, Simon, part of that question deals with potential claims as well, which I wouldn't probably deal with in a subsequent question, if that's okay. But it really is essentially, we've got the same duties if not a bit more, frankly, is the basic answer to that question. Do you have any additional points, Hayley? Maybe.
Yeah, I was just going to say. I mean, the HSC, interestingly, have advised that it's not necessary to carry out a DSE workstation assessment for temporary working at home during the pandemic. Now, I would adopt a cautious approach to that because, well, temporary. What does that mean? How long are we going to be here for? We're certainly probably going to be here for more weeks than we originally anticipated. But I think you are right, Paul, in that the duty that the employer has remains the same. Obviously, you have to look after your employees, whether they're at home or not, and you have to carry out that risk assessment. I think people shouldn't be too troubled or worried about the extent of what that detailed workstation risk assessment looks like. If you can carry out, guidance and support and advice on a one-to-one telephone call or a video call, whatever that may be, great. Or you can offer some sort of e-learning platform that helps employers with DSE assessments, which probably a lot of people have anyway, because a lot of organisations work remotely in an agile fashion. So hopefully what you have already can be adapted. If it's completely new to you as an organisation, then it's just looking at ways that you can deliver that training. And it might just be refresher training online or through telephone calls, but a lot of it is, relatively straightforward. It's common sense stuff. Don't get yourself too worked up about it. But again, I think it's important to recognise that the risk is there, especially if we're going to be here for some time.
Yeah.
Well, that does actually take us on to the more liability-centric question on this.
Yeah.
Was in normal circumstances, employers are required to check that staff working from home do so in a safe environment. COVID-19's meant that people have moved to working from home effectively overnight. Are employers at risk having not assessed working conditions, or does working from home change the employer's liability as the employee controls safety at home?
Yeah.
Paul?
Yeah. No, I think the basic answer to the are employers at risk if they've not assessed is yes. For the reasons we've just, discussed. I think from a lot of the questions I've had from clients over the last few weeks, it's sort of, I'm not suggesting anybody on this webinar falls into this category at all. So please don't take this the wrong way. Or be insulted, but there's almost we're almost forgetting that there is a plethora of health and safety legislation, case law, which deals with all of the employer duties, and working from home just because we're in a pandemic doesn't change that. The coronavirus regulations do not make any exceptions. In fact, they place additional duties on employers, meaning that perhaps the scope for employers' liability has increased. So I think to that extent, does it change the employer's liability at all? If it does at all, I think it places a greater duty on us because, as I said at the start, in answer to Hayley's first question, it's right in front of us. We're aware of the risks, but again, not to be all doom and gloom about it. There's really good guidance, as we've already said, from the government. I had a look actually at the ACAS guidance on this as well. Really good practical stuff as a starting point. I think, Simon, I'm right in saying if we've sort of used any sort of material that we've referred to, we're going to try and put that in a note and email it round after the session. Is that right?
That is absolutely right.
Yeah. So I won't dwell on specific guidance, but the basic answer to the question is most certainly I think that there'll be a potential for increased liabilities, and claimant lawyers always like to, shall we say, plough in fertile fields, and I think this is one of them. Hayley, do you, from a regulator or a criminal perspective, do you see any additional liabilities or?
No, I mean, I think you're right. The legislation is the same. I think it's just going to be how the local authority or the HSE choose to enforce it, and they're going to pick their cases wisely. And I think they'll reserve them for the ones that you can clearly see there's been a breach on the other part of the employer.
Yeah. I mean, we're saying all this. It wouldn't surprise me with a lot of this, depending on how long this goes on for, if we have sort of government legislation and very, very similar to what we had in the past with asbestos litigation. It was finally sort of, the case law was so historic and complex that the government legislated to bring it all under one roof. So it wouldn't surprise me, looking into the horizon, if all of these sorts of questions are legislated on to a degree in the future.
Okay. Well, I mean, just continuing the theme of the employee protection piece, we've had questions around PPE. And so specifically, what should employers be doing about providing PPE to their staff, and where can they get guidance on what PPE is required to be given to employees who may come into contact with the topic?
Yeah, I mean, PPE is a thorny topic anyway. Anybody that watches the daily Downing Street updates will see that. But from an employer's perspective, before coronavirus hit, then PPE should always be seen as a last resort to employees. You always have to look to see if you can control the risks in a different way. There's clearly certain industries at the moment where PPE is a necessity. So obviously NHS, social care sector, there is guidance out there in terms of the types of PPE and what you should be doing to provide that to employees. Practically, whether you can get it, I appreciate, is another problem at the moment. In terms of non-healthcare settings, again, you'll probably see if you listen to the Downing Street updates that jury really is still out in relation to, and when we're talking about PPE, I think probably the question is mainly in relation to face masks and the like. That seems to be the most straightforward type of PPE. I know some retailers have put up sort of plastic screens and things like that at checkouts, which is obviously a good protective measure. But I think in terms of the general duty of employers to provide employees with face masks, the government guidance is still that from a scientific and medical perspective, they can't determine whether that is the way forward. And it does seem to change, and you can see other countries have taken a different approach. So it wouldn't surprise me if there is a different approach that is taken in due course. But in terms of guidance at the moment, there isn't any in relation to those non-healthcare settings. I think in terms of, the specific question about whether employees that travel to and from work in terms of their daily commute, whether there's an obligation on employers to provide PPE or face masks there, again, I would say a daily commute to work is not considered to be at work for those purposes, a bit similar to, driving to and from work. I think it will come down to what the government ultimately conclude and decide in relation to the science behind face masks, and whether companies do then consider it reasonable to provide face masks to employees in the workspace or even outside of the workspace. So I think at the moment it may turn into more of a moral decision rather than a legal one, but I think we're just going to have to wait to see what the government's final position is on face masks.
Emma,
sorry.
Emma, anything to add from an employment perspective?
No, I think it really comes on to the other question that we've got, really more about what's the kind of employee right to have PPE, and also what happens if they refuse. Because I know one of the participants has also put up a question about employees being worried or concerned about coming back to work. And I suppose as part of this, what I see is that there is going to be pushback and challenge from members of your teams when they say, well, we've got to go back to work. How do I know I'm going to be safe? And obviously it's going to be, people have been away from work for quite a long time by the time we actually go back. So it's how you plan for that. And I know we're going to come on to talk about that a bit more in terms of how we get everyone back and whether we do it by phase, returns and so on. But one of these questions is going to be, how can you guarantee that I'm going to be safe and well at work? Because we've got no vaccination. I don't know who's had it. We've got no testing. So things like PPE then come into it, because people somehow think, well, if I wear some gloves and a face mask, whatever that might be, then I might be okay. But without the government guidance, without the clear direction, it's quite difficult as an employer to make a decision on it. I mean, if people want to opt to wear it, the question arises as to how practical that is in the workplace for conversations when you're using, WebExes and things like that, understanding what people are saying, whether it has an impact in terms of reactions to people's skin and things like that. I'm thinking a bit off the wall in terms of those sorts of things. But I suspect these sorts of things and this fear factor about what's going to happen when I go back, am I going to be exposed to this, how safe is it, is draws on people's concerns and worries. So as part of your planning to go back into the workplace, these are the sorts of things you need to be asking your workforce. So what are your thoughts? What are your trepidations about going back? How do you feel about it? Can we do things to make sure that you feel better about it? And how can we communicate with you following on from government guidance to make sure that you feel safe at work and that we've adequately dealt with those risk factors? Because I think all of this is about communication engagement. I've talked about this a lot, but understanding where those fears are and how we might overcome them and give people confidence in knowing that we know what we're doing and that we are following government guidance.
Well, that I think plays into the one of the next questions that we had on the employment side. A key question that we've had asked in a number of different ways, but it boils down to how can you best avoid breach of contract claims? Presumably, some of those themes play into that as well.
Yeah, because I think when you talk about breach of contract claims, obviously that has a wide scope. It could mean anything. But in terms of the employment context, what I'd be thinking about would be claims based on either an express breach of contract, i.e. you fail to pay people, or you enforce something like furlough without agreement and things like that. Those can obviously lead to breach of contract, i.e. constructive dismissal claims. But you've also got claims arising from the breach of health and safety and inability to provide a safe place of work. And then you've got these implied duties in the relationship which go to trust and confidence. And a lot of those sorts of things are going to be more about your communication and how you talk to staff and engage with them and make sure you do your risk assessments and eliminate risk within the workforce so that people feel they can go back and they feel safe. So that's more about the sort of implied duties and the safe place of work. So there's this two elements, I suppose. There's the express stuff and there's the implied stuff. And all of those go to this element of actually whether the individual's then going to raise complaints and whether we can deal with those issues early doors, because I think in order to avoid those sorts of things, i.e. firstly you try and get agreement from employees if you're trying to change their terms and conditions, you're trying to put them on furlough which requires agreement, things like that. But where you've got implied breaches, if people start raising complaints about things, and they could be anything from so-and-so's not observing social distancing to, my commute to work is going to cause me problems because it could be all sorts of different things, or, I don't want to sit next to them because they've been coughing a lot. So all those sorts of things play into this, well, how am I going to deal with this situation? Because we don't want this to get worse and worse. It becomes either a collective grievance or a serial grievance from different members of staff, and that sort of builds momentum, and then you get obviously things like people refusing to come to work, and then you're looking to try and force people to come back. And that's when you end up with claims. So if you can deal with those issues early on, and again, I go back to my point about planning for this return and taking these issues head on. So finding out what the issues are now before we start getting people to go back. So looking ahead and thinking, well, what resistance am I going to get? What are people saying to me now? And then trying to plan for those issues to make sure that we've got people engaged and that we reduce the risks of people complaining or, eventually resigning or refusing to come to work, which is entirely possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Emma. I mean, one of the things that you mentioned there a couple of times was furlough and the importance of furlough into this process. And unsurprisingly, we've had a number of questions on that also. The key one being, can an employer get employees to consent to a deferred payment under furlough?
Yeah, so I think with furlough, I know we've had a lot of guidance. Some of it has been better than others. Some of it has been slightly contradictory, the most recent stuff from Treasury. So we're trying to work our way through this system. It's difficult, so I do sympathise, and we are endeavouring to sort of try and deal with issues as they come along. And one of the things that has come up is obviously things like cash flow. If I can't pay my staff, what am I supposed to do? So I think this is where it comes from, that some employers are in the position, unfortunately, because they can't trade, they haven't got the money coming in, and therefore they can't afford to pay staff. So this promise of deferral of pay. And what the guidance suggests is that if you are genuinely if the employee is genuinely going to expect that money, then that should be okay, because there is a difference between deferral and conditional. If you make payment conditional on being paid out under the scheme, that in itself potentially is not going to work based on Treasury direction. So the idea being is it should be an expected amount of money that's got to be paid to the individual, and it may be because of cash flow that you're not able to pay it. But the other thing that the scheme is supposed to be is a reimbursement. So the government was saying to employers, you pay your staff as normal, or at the 80%, which you're looking to get reimbursement for, or up to the 2.5%. But it's a reimbursement, so you pay it, and then we will reimburse you. Obviously, that sounds great in an ideal world. However, you've got to go online and submit the employee details, and that relies on that money being paid back to you. But in theory, the idea is you should have the cash to pay the people and then be reimbursed. However, the reality of the situation is, in a lot of cases, you don't have the money to do it, and therefore you may say to your staff, look, I'll pay you something, and the rest of it will be deferred pending this payment being made. And based on Treasury direction as of this week, that seems to be fine.
Speaking of cash flow, as you mentioned, Shoesmith does have a really useful note summarising all of the different packages of support that's available from governmental bodies. Debbie, if we could make that document available on the hub, that would be really useful as well, just so people that are having, or businesses that are having issues on the cash flow side can have that summary of what's available in terms of financial support. But moving on to the next key employment issue, Emma, is around holidays. So we received a question that a lot of staff are cancelling holidays, unsurprisingly. Are companies requiring employees to take holiday, for instance, pro rata? And what happens if we reject holiday requests when employees return to the office, for instance, because it's too busy? How much holiday can they carry over to the next year? So a fair bit to unpack there, Emma.
Yeah, there is.
Leave that with you.
Thank you. I think the thing with the position is that I won't bore you all with working time regulations, but fundamentally, in this country, basically, people are entitled to 5.6 weeks a year on a full-time basis. Obviously, you can have enhanced requirements on top of that, but in essence, you continue to accrue holiday, and you are required to take it within the required holiday year generally. The problem we've now got is that employees are being put onto furlough. I say agree to be put onto furlough. And a lot of people obviously had holidays booked, may well have then had them cancelled because they've been put on furlough. Or they may well have had holiday bookings where they've decided, well, I've got to work anyway, so I'm going to cancel it. So it's all been a bit of a mess, unfortunately. And we have had some guidance, but not very much, with how furlough works. But we're now in a position where we're still waiting for the Chancellor, for the Treasury to confirm whether actually anyone can be actually properly on holiday and on furlough at the same time. It's a bit of a mess. But fundamentally, what has happened in a lot of cases, because initially when the scheme came out for furlough, lots of people's holidays were cancelled on the basis we didn't think you could be both. However, there seems to be a suggestion now that you could potentially be on holiday and furlough at the same time, and that you may have to top up. But watch this space on that, because we're still waiting for guidance. The other issue then comes if you have cancelled all holiday, what do you then do when you go back, say in the summer, and you've got a load of staff who've accrued all this holiday and they've not been able to take it? I mean, arguably there is now this legislation that's put in place which would allow you to potentially defer it over the next 2 holiday years, but that would only be a working time holiday. So that is not any contractual element, because that's up to you how you dictate how that's dealt with. But it would be effectively, not to bore you with the details, but effectively the 4 weeks holiday that you come from the original working time regulations. So it's only a limited amount of the holiday, but it essentially gives you an ability to sort of allow employees to roll it over into the next 2 years. But that's only because the employee has not been able to take it, really. So there is that ability. However, what a lot of employers may want to do is at the end of furlough ask employees to take holiday potentially before they go back, in which case you can give them notice. So you can actually give them twice the amount of notice of the length of holiday you want to take. So say you wanted them to take a week's holiday, you give them 2 weeks notice of the requirement to take that holiday. So one thing you could think about doing in terms of workforce planning, given that you might, when they come back from furlough, you might not have the work for them to do and you want them to use up holiday, is you could put them on holiday for a week or whatever before they then come back. All of this should be in consultation, obviously, as I say, because the last thing from an employee relations point of view is you want, when you go back to work, you need people to muck in and basically get down to it, is grievances and all sorts. But fundamentally, there is an ability within the working time regulations for you to be able to require people to take holiday when you need it. Or conversely, where you're in times of busy, when you're busy, you can actually cancel that holiday. However, as I say, what you want to be highlighting to people is if they've had to cancel their holiday, there is this ability to carry it over. So there is a mechanism, and I think the main reason for bringing this carryover into play was more in relation to key workers rather than your general employees who are being furloughed. It's more in respect of, say, the health sector or, you know, supermarkets, that kind of delivery sector where we're just all hands on deck, isn't it, effectively? But there is this ability. So it does allow you to plan your holidays better, but there is still an ability as an employer to have a certain element of control over holidays.
Thank you, Emma. One of the things that you mentioned there was grievances, which plays into the next question, which is, will deadlines, including periods for limitation, be suspended or extended for a period of 2 to 3 months when COVID is over?
It's a good point, and I think in terms of the Employment Tribunal, there's nothing that we've seen as yet which effectively changes or extends deadlines for Employment Tribunal purposes. But anyone who's dealt with the tribunals will be aware that there is quite an ability to extend those deadlines where you need them. It's not as formal as it is with the civil courts. You are generally supposed to put a claim in within 3 months, give or take, with ACAS conciliation. But with claimants, and if they are late putting them in, and similarly with responses, there is an ability to extend that time frame, or where you've missed them, to ask for reconsideration. And what the tribunals have said is that in this time, according to presidential guidance, there will be some element of give and take on that. So where employers have to put defences into claims and they just don't receive them in time, or they've hit somebody's desk but they're not there. Because this is practical, this is difficult. You know, people are not in the workplace to deal with these sorts of issues. They have said you can put in things like holding responses and they will consider things out of time. So I think although limitations won't change as such, because I can't see, well, I could be wrong here, I can't see them physically changing it, there will be a discretion here. The judges will have this ability to allow claims out of time, I suspect. And similarly with employers where they might have missed deadlines putting responses in, there will be a certain amount of leeway for employers.
And looking at timescales, what the next question was around guidelines for when we are able to return to work. Is there anything in the public domain currently in that respect? Hayley?
No, sadly not. The government hasn't issued any guidance in relation to, obviously, the return to work measures yet. There's only guidance there for those that can go to work at the moment. I'm sure it will come through as part of the measures when we come out of this phased lockdown, but no, in terms of guidelines for return to work, not yet.
Okay, so let's moving on. I'm conscious of time. We've still got a couple of questions to work through. So after the lockdown has been lifted, can employers insist that employees return to work in the office, even where they can work from home effectively? Once the government allows businesses to open, what are our options if employees still don't feel safe to leave their homes, perhaps because they've had to use public transport and come into a job that can't be done at home? Equally, what if the job can be done at home and the employee wishes to stay there? Can we force them to return? I know that we've touched on this a couple of times over the session. Just to recap, Emma.
Yeah, I think it's a tough one, isn't it? Because nobody wants to be sort of draconian about this and forcing people to return. But fundamentally, the variation to the fact that people have to work from home is enforced. It's not something that we've chosen to do. It's not something that has immediately been agreed as an indefinite variation. So workplaces, whatever your contract says, is your place of work. So what we would be doing as part of this plan to return everyone back to work is to get them back into the workplace. But we need to be mindful of things like schools reopening. So are people going to be able to have childcare in place in time? You know, people's circumstances may have changed in terms of other halves or spouses, partners, workload. So there might be applications for things like flexible working or changes to working. We also need to be aware of there are people out there who will still be high risk. That's not going to go anywhere. So the question arises is in terms of phased returns, how we get people back and what stages we get people back. And it may be that until we are in a position where we've got vaccinations and we can get more certainty that certain employees will still be shielded. I don't know. I don't know what the guidance will be, but it's something we will have to think about in terms of how we best prepare people for going back and engaging and communicating with them. But fundamentally, when the lockdown is over, in theory, there is no reason why people cannot return to the workplace, because workplaces will be reopened, because you won't have to work from home because the office, their place of work, is open. But fully expect, because of this agility, because employees will be saying, I proved you wrong, I can work from home, we're going to get a lot more pushback and a lot more challenges.
And I think this next one is perhaps a Hayley and Paul question, but in terms of that day that seems a long way away as we sit here now, but when we are all back to work, what are the general health and safety obligations when requiring people to return to the office? Should everyone be issued a face mask?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the question we had earlier in terms of, I think we need to see what the government guidance says, or if that changes in relation to face masks, and whether we adopt that different approach in terms of PPE. In terms of health and safety obligations, obviously they're not going to change when people come back to work, in that the duty remains the same. But in terms of that risk assessment that we spoke so highly of earlier, and making sure that it's detailed, bespoke, comprehensive for the organisation, that is obviously a risk assessment that's in place at the moment whilst we're dealing with this set of circumstances. As and when we come back to work, we've got more people in the workplace. What's that going to mean for social distancing and all of the other control measures that we are probably going to be expected to put into place? It will mean revising that risk assessment to make sure that, again, it's comprehensive, current and up to date and relevant. Paul, I don't know if there's anything from your perspective to add to that.
I think I know a lot of people at the office who would perhaps like me to wear a face mask. No, I think that covers it really well. It's going to be, I mean, I would add to that, perhaps pay particular attention to vulnerable workers if we have a staged return to work, for instance. Yeah. So that you might, I mean, I think as well, it's a really good opportunity to sort of look at if home working has benefited your organisation. I mean, there's a lot of bad in this, but there's a lot of good coming out of it, certainly in our business, for instance. But I think as well, Hayley, with that, we ought to see further government HSE regulator guidance on it, which of course we will keep a keen eye out for.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the future, Paul, we often finish these sessions with top tips, but we had a question that seemed to nicely encapsulate that as an endpoint, which is, do you envisage any changes in approach during this crisis, remaining in the post-crisis world? If so, which ones and in what form? I think I can pose that as an open question to the panel.
Oh, that's a great question. I think certainly in my sort of narrow part of the world, as I've already said, liability claims are going to be quite a fertile ground, even if they've got no merit. So you might see changes in the sense you see a surge in that. You know, if you haven't sort of followed the guidance, do you really want the hassle and potential bad PR engaging in that? An upsurge in the litigation process. That's one thing I can see sort of might happen. So, you know, and so ensuring that you live and breathe your policies and procedures, as I said earlier, that all-important paper trail. I think the insurance industry, from my perspective, is likely to exclude sort of COVID, liability for COVID going forward in sort of standard policies. That's one post-crisis thing I might say. I mean, for instance, they did exactly that following SARS and the MERS epidemics around the world, and so they're often excluded. And even if they're not, you're going to sort of have to avail yourselves of sort of specific bolt-on pieces of cover, not just in employers and public liability insurance, but, directors and officers, for instance, that could be impacted. Will we see a sweeping change in, what's on offer insurance-wise to protect businesses? So absolutely key for me, I think, Simon, is both now and post this crisis to look at your suite of documents. Absolutely critical. It's not all doom and gloom, though. If you tackle the basic measures, as we've been discussing here, to sort of protect employees and members of the public, most of the steps. I mean, obviously there are some real challenges, as these great questions we've had demonstrate. But a lot of it is sort of is straightforward. But I think a much greater awareness and robust management is my biggest takeaway.
Thank you, Paul. Emma, I'm conscious of time, so keep it to 30
Yeah, I'll be quick.
Go.
I promise.
Sorry.
Well, right. So yeah, I think it's more agility. I think we're going to see a different. We're definitely going to see a different approach in terms of how employers deal with these sorts of things, because it's definitely been a change of mindset for some of my clients who were very much against home working. So I think we're going to definitely move into a change of mindset, much more positive environment. I think in terms of dealing with flexibility and agility, and dealing with things like, the fact that people want to be more agile and flexible about when they work because of childcare, because of caring responsibilities, because they have a life. So I just think, we are going to change the way we work. It's never going to be the same again. I just don't think, and look at, the fact that we're doing these webinars, we are seeing each other. We don't need to be in the office every day to do this.
And last but not least,
am I allowed 30 seconds?
You are.
Yeah, I think just following on from Emma's point, I mean, in terms of working from home from a health and safety perspective, I know that we have the issues about, how employers do a DSE assessment from home, but ultimately, when people realise they can work from home, and certainly employers realise that as well, and they can trust their employees to do so, then there's less need to go into the office. That reduces all the risks around that. But just from a pure financial perspective, I mean, I hate video calls at the best of times, and I always just used to use it as an excuse to say that I can't use the technology to do them when we used to work in the office. But now that we're forced to do it and we have to do it, it's relatively easy to have a video call or a webinar or whatever it may be. And therefore, in terms of travel costs to employers, just think of the amount of money that will be saved there. And obviously, always ended on a positive note, the positive impact it'll have on the environment as well, which can obviously never be a bad thing. So, as Paul said, it's not all doom and gloom. There are lots of positives out there.
Will indeed. It will also mean that everyone has to keep about 90 degrees worth of their room clean at all times for the video calls. Thank you very much to the panel for your insights today. Apologies to the attendees. We've run over by a couple of minutes, but I hope that you see that as just an indicator as to how much there was to unpack today and how much there is to say on this topic. If you have any more questions or want to talk to a member of the team, please do get in touch. Our contact details are on screen now. You will also receive an invitation to our Shared and Halved hub site, which will include links to this webinar as well as others that you might be interested in. So as and when that link comes through, please do take the opportunity to...
I think, Simon, I think what we're going to try to do is the questions we didn't have time for, we will do our best to produce a summary document for the attendees. So we'll try to answer them in that format. So the ones we can get to, if we can, yeah.
You took the words out of my mouth.
Sorry, Simon, I apologise.
We will be moderating that site too, so we'll endeavour to answer any questions that are asked there. And we will be producing a 1 or 2 slide summary note of this session with the key takeaway points. You can also visit our coronavirus COVID-19 hub on the Systems website, and again, there'll be a link to that on the hub. So that remains for me only to say thank you for your time today, and please do stay in touch.